Now, I'll ask each of our panelists to give a short overview of their efforts and current work. I specifically asked them to talk about the 2 or 3 most important things that they are doing to help land managers adapt to climate change. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions via the chat. We'll begin with Angus Emmet. Angus?
Joel, thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Very good. So I live on the other side of the world, as Joel said, and I won't be going into anything with regards to policies and ways that you can make climate change policy more effective, but and on the ground more effective. What I'm going to do is tell you briefly about where I live. I'm going to keep it simple, no PowerPoints or anything, because our technology is not this wonderful in this part of the world. So I'm going to just tell you who I am, where I am. I'm a beef cattle producer, and a little bit of what we're doing, and then talk a little bit about the federal level, Australian government level. So, as I said, I'm Angus Emmet. I'm a beef cattle producer with my wife and son. Our daughter lives a long way south from here, down in Tasmania, but we run a beef cattle operation in the top end of the Queensland Channel Country. Queensland Channel Country is an amazing part of the world, but first I'll go back a step and just take you to where I actually live. For those of you that don't know Australia well, if you go up the east coast, because remember we're in the other hemisphere here, if you go up the east coast until you get to the Tropic of Capricorn, and then go 500 miles inland to Longreach, then go down the river, Thompson River, for another 90 miles, you get to our place. So we've got 130,000 acres of beef cattle country out in the scrub and the Channel Country. Keep talking about the Channel Country. It's an amazing part of the world. It's an area of braided and estimating streams that spread out to nearly 60 miles. I've got to convert everything to imperial for you, Mod, but nearly 60 miles wide in places. And in a big flood, we have an area, well, when I say we, Australia has an area in the Channel Country underwater greater than the whole of Great Britain. This is an amazing natural pasture, and I haven't done the conversions on this, but we can put on, with natural pasture with beef, we can put on 2 kilograms a day just feeding beef on natural pasture. The Lake Eyre Basin that I live in is the largest internally draining basin in the world, and it's roughly 1/6 of the landmass of Australia, which is equivalent to 1/6 of the landmass of North America. So over the last 20 or 30 years, one of the big issues here with climate change is it's getting hotter and drier. With one of the particular points about that is the minimums are getting a lot hotter as well. So the country's just drying out a lot quicker. So we have huge issues with water availability in the dry times. And it gets hot. Back in November of this year, we were getting up to 49 degrees Celsius, which is 120 in your scale, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And these long dry periods are interspaced with extreme wet events when they do happen. But just looking at long-term dry, one of the issues there is, for instance, Longreach, which is my closest town, it had the second largest beef cattle sale yard in Queensland, and it had a sale with large numbers of cattle every Wednesday. It hasn't been operational for 10 years now due to extended dry periods. Then we get issues around extreme wet events. 2 years ago, there was a big rainfall depression came in from the Coral Sea and came in through Townsville and out into the Mitchell Grass Downs, and it just sat there for nearly 2 weeks. It killed in excess of 750,000 head of stock. There was extreme flooding. It washed away roads, it washed away railway lines, it washed away all the fences, it buried houses, it stripped the pasture. So it killed all the wildlife as well as the livestock. So that's the 2 extremes that we're facing here in Australia at the moment. Well, in Western Queensland. Australia's a big place, roughly the same size as the US, as I said. So I'll go into what we're doing here. We used to breed cattle and sell beef cattle, but we found that with extended long periods of dry, we couldn't get stock off the country in dry periods. So we've gone from breeding to just buying and selling steers depending on the availability of food. We're lucky in this regard because just north of us, we've got all the Gulf Savannah country, which is great for breeding, but not very good for fattening. So we have a ready supply of steers. Obviously, not everyone can do this. But in doing this, we can control the actual number of hooves in our country. We can unload all of our stock in dry times. Either if they're not, we can't finish them off, we can feedlot them and send them off. But most of the time we finish them off and they go straight to works, straight to meat works. And another thing that I've done on top of that, and a few of us are starting to do it, and it's to do with total grazing pressure. And that is the fact that kangaroo, it's probably the same with deer with you, but we have a lot of problem with lots of kangaroos. The last 20 years, I left the dingoes alone. They've stayed or formed their own family groups, and they keep the breed numbers very low. They keep the cats and foxes. Well, they've got rid of the cats and foxes, and they keep the feral pigs down. So we've now, for no time and no cost, we've actually got full control of our grazing pressure. So that's helped us a lot. So two things that follow on from that. I think what I might just talk now about a group that I'm a board member of, and it's called Farmers for Climate Action. And any of you that are interested in following up that in more detail can go onto our website. But Farmers for Climate Action are a grassroots organisation that were very concerned with the lack of action on climate policy by Australian governments. So we formed a group, and we do the two main things we do. We work with agriculture on the ground, running workshops or various different ways on the ground, actually just looking at mitigation and adaptation. And this is very successful, and membership's growing exponentially. But the other really important thing we do is working with policymakers and the Australian government and the state governments to actually develop climate-friendly policy. One of the, excuse me, just mute for 2 seconds. I'm going to have a cough. So one of the big initiatives we have in the red meat sector is we've made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030. And we've got a great research project that's actually starting to unroll commercially, but it's using some of the red seaweeds as a feed supplement that actually almost eliminates the methane output of cattle. But working with the governments is very important. We have an Australian government that is not keen on the idea of acting on climate change. And we have, differently to the US, we've only got 5 states and 2 territories, so we've got a lot less people. Well, and only about 25 million people in the whole of Australia for a similar landmass. But this allows us to more effectively target politics. But we're hoping, well, the states are doing a great job in actually beginning to act on climate and put in sensible policy. And they're putting pressure on the federal government. And we're hoping you'll change the leadership over in the US, and policy coming out of Japan and coming out of the EU will put further pressure on our government. But climate change is a real, very real thing. It's not something out in the future. It's something that we are feeling the effects of out here in Western Queensland right now. And if we don't do something about it, much of inland Australia will become uninhabitable in the hotter months of the year. So it's not just some desktop exercise, it's our future we're talking about out here. And if we actually act on climate, there's a whole heap of things that we can do to make our businesses not only climate friendly, but more profitable. And we can also work with renewable energy companies, etc., because we do have land. We've got a lot of land in Australia with very, very few people on it. So, Joel, I think I'll just leave it at that and take questions after, but it's just to give a little bit of a different view on what's happening in a different part of the world.
Thanks, Angus. And I can attest and support Angus's comments about amazing. The first time I was ever in that part of the world, it took me 3 days to actually accept what I saw. It was truly a unique place. Well, thanks, Angus. Let's move to our next speaker now, Haley Wilmer. As I said earlier, Haley is with the Forest Service in Juneau, Alaska, and is probably pretty well known to most of us in that work in rangelands for her work with the Agriculture Research Service in Cheyenne. Haley?
Thanks, Joel. And thanks, Angus. It's, I love to hear the Australian perspective, not only just to deal with the really different dynamics that you face, but you're at least a day ahead of us at all times. So thanks for getting up early to be here. It's important for me to start my talk kind of with two acknowledgements. I'm speaking today from Tlingit Homelands in Juneau, Alaska, but I'll be focusing on the Western Great Plains. And I also want to note that a big part of the conversation that I want to bring to the table, not just about the region that I've been doing work in for the last 8 years or so, but also just to acknowledge the really intimate knowledge that producers have. When I talk about climate change and farming and ranching context, I like to always just acknowledge that the ways that producers understand climate and weather dynamics, and the way that they have to get up and do it every day in and day out, with very little control over what's going on, is really important to our understanding of how to adapt to climate change. And so this presentation that I put together some different ways of thinking together with science and that local knowledge where they can kind of interact to show us some places or some different scales or opportunities for flexibility. And just like rangelands around the world, the Great Plains is characterized by lots of variability. It was shaped by variability in grazing intensity, precipitation, fire regimes, and there's of course these precipitation and temperature gradients that in the shortgrass steppe and mixed grass prairie, where most of what I'm going to be talking about, really kind of shape the context. A lot of what we know about how American society adapts to extreme drought events and how agriculture adapts to extreme drought events come from this part of the world where the events of the Dust Bowl, which just actually reshaped USDA, reshaped the way we thought about the Great Plains and a lot of social science as well. But even today, producers in this region deal with a lot of interannual variability. You can see the precipitation chart from the Central Plains Experimental Range, which is just outside of Fort Collins. So folks are trying to produce cow-calf yearling operations and manage for biodiversity and shifting rural demographics all at the same time in a really uncertain context. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that folks like Justin Durner, David Augustine, and I have been characterizing forms of flexibility at some different scales. We talk a lot about the pasture and growing season scales. I think we can extend our thinking to the production calendar outside of just an individual farmer ranch, across generations, and maybe into some new spaces with shifting baselines and climate that show us how climate and different sociological and economic characteristics are interconnected in these ranching systems. So the point of this is just to give us some different angles to see flexibility. After the Dust Bowl, research started on the Central Plains Experimental Range, and we've done a lot of work to understand the variability in space and time and how to promote flexibility in terms of anticipating and predicting with conservative stocking rates and decision support tools and forecasts the different variability, tracking it, finding ways to flex, perhaps with yearlings or other ways to limit the risk of variable production, and then finding it or creating it. So maybe grass banks or moving around in space to deal with that variability. The growing season scale is the bread and butter of range science. We're really good at thinking about flexibility at the growing season scale, but how often do we talk about the whole ranch year? And I was really excited in the social science session to see some mention of calving, mention of these interconnected decisions. I've just put together a really oversimplified model of some of the decisions that are interconnected across the calendar year, so we can start to think about where changes in phenology, changes in extreme events, and changes in variability connect across years and across decisions. So moving a calving date up might impact consequences in grazing in the growing season. And then you add in possibly a drought, you're going to see some shifts across the whole year. And then, of course, all of these other decisions in a ranch family or community. I have ranchers in my long-term social monitoring project where basketball season has a lot to do with how they decide to move their cattle, because they need to know where they are so they can get to games on time and be there for their family, because that's important as well. So it's an interconnected system, and the production calendar way of thinking about change and climate change within the production calendar can show us opportunities for flexibility, as well as places where we have rigidity in the system or a lot of path dependency. If you stopped by a drought school at Colorado State Extension that Retta Brugger and I put on, you would notice that we're influenced by our mentor, Maria Fernandez Jimenez, and the work in international pastoralist adaptive capacity, which involves thinking outside of just the ranch scale and thinking about the community. When I think of a ranching community like the ones that I was around growing up in Shields Valley, Montana, or Paradise Valley, Montana, there was a lot of exchange of knowledge and labor. Sometimes it was based in the market, sometimes it was just family and friends. The international pastoralist literature really pushes us to think about moving risk in space through mobility, moving risk in time through storage, moving risk across asset classes through diversification. Some examples of that would be adding in some yearlings or different breeds, but also different income sources. Moving risk across organizations or households. So broad-based social networks can exchange equipment, ideas, just honestly moral support. An example of this is brandings. And then market-based approaches, of course, insurance-based or non-traditional marketing strategies, or just forage purchases are ways that communities exchange goods and services that are really important. The key variable here that we talk a lot about in social science that I think really relates to how we're thinking about the whole ranch system now in range science is neighbors. Neighbors are a key variable in adaptive capacity at the community scale, and possibly across rangeland ecological regions as well. Another scale to think about is sort of the scale at which our local knowledge develops. And there are times when it might be mismatched with the climate dynamics we're observing, not even just from climate change, but from climate itself. When I was in Fort Collins, I sat next to an ecologist, E.J. Rayner, who's pictured there. He's actually on a hippopotamus grazing lawn in Botswana, I think, in that photo. He was putting together some long-term data from the Central Plains Experimental Range, where they had stocked cattle at 3 densities since 1940 and measured large herbivore production, cattle production from those pastures. And EJ was trying to understand the connection between that production, that beef production, and anomalies in sea surface temperature to give us some idea of how managers might reduce risks, knowing that variability had been observed to be a little bit higher in production during a cold Pacific decadal oscillation phase. So what you see here in this graph on the bottom is that EJ binned the different PDO phases, which flip from warm to cold at the decadal or multi-decadal scale. And across the y-axis, variance in large herbivore production, or the spread in production across that herd at different stock densities, the highest of which is this black line. So we see in periods like 1945 to 1977 and 1999 to 2013, a lot of variance in herbivore production, especially at these high stock densities. EJ and Retta Brugger worked together to put together a really nice decision tree to help folks think about sea surface temperature anomalies and stocking rate and stock density decision making that I think is a pretty novel product from this kind of long-term data set. But when I saw this as an ethnographer and I started thinking about how producers make decisions, I noticed something kind of interesting. I started to wonder if maybe in this system, that variability sort of skips a generation. And we know that producers learn from their parents, they learn from other community members who have been through the tough times. And it lined up kind of interestingly with some interviews that I'd done with ranchers in Wyoming who described the challenges of making it through the droughts of the 2000s. Hit with drought for the first time in 2002, some of these ranchers didn't know what to do. That would make sense. Their parents didn't deal with that level of variance in production, especially if they were at these high stock densities. But their grandparents probably had and may have dealt with some of these things and built some capacity into the system. For example, the rancher that we interviewed in Wyoming had a yearling operation, was able to flex. His parents just hadn't had to do it. So thinking about the temporal scale of climate and how it might be mismatched with how we learn from each other in a ranching community can be really interesting and informative as we look down on our systems and try to find ways to flex and adapt. But sometimes, especially when it comes to a changing climate and climate dynamics, this can result in completely different relationships or completely different conditions that nobody's had to deal with before. And the example of that is rising atmospheric CO2, levels of which are now higher than any of the plants we're managing have ever dealt with. So we understand some of the ways that rising atmospheric CO2 impacts plant communities and plant growth, increasing photosynthesis and transpiration, which open chamber experiments at high levels of CO2 suggest will lead to increased productivity but decreased forage quality. If we're managing plant communities in a new atmospheric condition, we might expect to deal with shifting baselines, this idea that things just aren't the way they've ever been before, and it's important for us to recognize that, to find ways to think about flexibility and anticipate change. Okay, and last but not least, I have to bring in the work of my colleague Christina Green, a postdoc at the University of Arizona, who's been working with focus group data with ranching communities around the West. And this team of folks asked these communities, how do you define resilience on your own terms? Of course, they described ecological change and climate conditions as a big form of risk. They also talked about economic, ranching community, and land use change decision-making or political contexts as big drivers of their ability to adapt and stay resilient. They also talked about how these things are simultaneously connected. So developing a perfectly adapted climate-smart ranching system won't work unless it also has economic, sociological, and political implications and adaptations. Ranchers also are telling us in these focus groups that they have a lot less capacity to adapt to those other more political and sociological challenges than they do at managing risk in forage production in the agricultural system, which is basically a system that they're pretty much masters at. So that scale beyond the climate is also important, and I think we could do more as range scientists to think about that. All right, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Haley. If anybody needed any proof that what Haley said about things may be different now than they ever have been before, I suspect that a large portion of our audience, Haley, is colder than you are right now, and you're in Alaska. So yeah, things are different. I'll move to our next speaker now, Emily Elias. Emily?
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear what Haley has to say. And I'm excited to hear what you said, Haley, about neighbors. And I think I'll key in on some of that in this update. So when Joel asked us to be involved, he asked what the most important things we can do to support climate adaptation on rangelands are. And so this image, some of you have probably been here. This is the Jornada Experimental Range in southern New Mexico, home of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. And it's always good to pictures help. So I am with the Southwest Hub in Las Cruces, New Mexico. There are 10 hubs across the United States. They were developed in 2014 with a mission to develop and deliver science-based region-specific information and technologies so that agricultural and natural resource land managers are empowered to make climate-informed decisions. And I want to mention actually the same study that Haley mentioned from a little bit of a different context. This is a NIFA-funded project called Ranching Rangelands and Resilience, sort of led by Katie Suding and Peter Adler and many other people that I don't want to forget. And I share it here as a reminder of climate vulnerability and context. So this project is using a traditional vulnerability framework where John Bradford looked at exposure, which is changes in precipitation and temperature, and those then impact sensitivity, and this is sensitivity of the vegetation community. So these are sensitivity projections that Andrew Felton and Peter Adler came up with for the end of the century using sort of the highest emissions scenarios to show where climate change may factor most prominently into adaptation. And that's really in the South. What you can see here is that these are decreases in above ground net primary productivity, mean annual, and those changes are really much more significant and apparent in the southern part of the rangelands in the north. And so in the north, the factors or constraints that people might consider are market forces, other things. They may be higher on the list when we're considering management and adaptation priorities than climate change. And I think this really ties in well to what both Angus and Haley said before about the multiple factors that we're thinking about when we think about climate change and adaptation. So to circle back, I'm going to be talking about the most important things we can do to support climate adaptation on those southern or southwestern rangelands. And so this is my top list, my top 5. And I think this first item, building networks, links to that piece about neighbors. So in the Southwest, there was a devastating drought in 2018. You can see it here on the bottom left. The dark color is D4, that's exceptional drought, and it hovered over the Four Corners area or the Colorado Plateau for almost all of 2018. The folks on the right are talking with some leaders about some of their challenges and asking for some immediate and emergency support. And from this drought, the Southwest Climate Hub partnered with the National Drought Mitigation Center and the National Integrated Drought Information Center to create a drought learning network. The point of this network is really to support peer-to-peer and community-to-community drought knowledge exchange. And part of the reason for that is, of course, this wasn't the first drought. And we're in a very similar drought now, so it certainly wasn't the last. And the goal is to really retain management lessons. What are people learning during these drought events that could be helpful in the future? And then also to foster knowledge exchange between climate service providers and natural resource managers. So this network has been in existence really just for a year, since February last year. And this is what has developed. These people working together on 6 different teams. So these teams emerged because people realized they were the big drought challenges, or that's what was needed. So there's a drought and agriculture team. There is a projections to people team, and that's really asking people what type of climate projections would be helpful for you in making your management decisions. What type of information is needed so that the service providers are giving information to answer the questions that people are having. There's a drought response team that only jumps into action when we're in exceptional or extreme drought, so the most severe classifications of drought. There's a team that works specifically with the Pueblos and indigenous nations in our region. And then there's a team that works on sharing drought experiences and drought stories. And then finally, there is a group of people that works on getting drought information from the ground to state drought task forces so that it then becomes part of the drought monitor maps to ensure that we're really capturing drought conditions well on the ground. So in the first year, 33 organizations joined and about double the number of individuals. The network hosted 17 workshops and webinars reaching over 1,200 people. And I want to bring up the Sharing Drought Experiences team because they used something that was already in existence. It was a toolbox already set up. And in the last year, they came up with 7 case studies. And I mention these because I think these are some of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about adaptation to climate change. So the things that rose to the top were heritage genetics to increase cattle resilience during drought, rancher to rancher, which is building a community for conservation, and this one was in Montana. Drought mitigation through both land management and water distribution. Also thinking about river systems, about restoration following fire in one location, and could another location learn from what they did in Nevada. Identifying community resilience to drought hazards, and this was in the South Central US, but how could that be helpful in the Southwest? And then developing tools for improved water supply forecasting. So if any of those teams are interesting to you, we're having our virtual annual meeting in just a few weeks. The second item that rose to the top for me was incorporating climate into resource management decisions via a process. And I know NRCS has a 9-step process that they go through in conservation planning. This process is actually from the Northern Forest Climate Hub, but it involves working with groups of people to define management objectives for a particular piece of land, and then assess climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And that can be through all sorts of information, vulnerability assessments, traditional ecological knowledge, literature, and then evaluate management objectives again in light of that climate change information, and then identify adaptation tactics. And this comes from a menu of different adaptation strategies and approaches. So our team will be working with the Rio Grande Basin Study and the Bureau of Reclamation and groups of irrigators to work through an 8-week adaptation planning and practices course to try to help that group identify their own adaptation projects for the Rio Grande. The next item I think is important to mention is considering alternate or different management options. So this is from another NIFA-funded research project, the Sustainable Southwest Beef Project, led by Sherry Spiegel and many others. And this project's looking at Robert Murray Criollo cattle or heritage genetics and how crossbreeds could be potentially helpful in changing environmental conditions. We're also looking at precision ranching technologies and how those technologies could be helpful or useful in the southwestern US. And then finally, they're looking at different supply chain options, so doing things differently. There are a lot of different examples from different systems. Regenerative agriculture is a good example, or agrovoltaics, dual uses, wind energy and bioenergy, sort of non-traditional revenue streams. So that's my third suggestion or item. And then the fourth builds on that, and that's testing and sharing different innovations. And I just picked out a few I wanted to highlight. One is precision ranching, so using different types of systems. The new one that is being evaluated by the Southwest Beef Project is LoRaWAN. And so that is, there are GPS-enabled tracking collars that they're testing. There's also water level sensors that are being tested. Another innovation is a little bit more physical, is reducing evapotranspiration losses from stock tanks. This is being tested by Mary Nichols and the Malpai Borderlands group folks. But it's an interesting idea, and testing that and seeing if it could be helpful in reducing water loss is an idea that people are testing. Probably a lot of people have heard of GrassCast, but it is an annual forage prediction tool out of the Northern Plains Climate Hub. It's moved to the Southern Plains and is now in the Southwest. And it allows producers to help make decisions based on the likely forage production this year. And then finally, land potential knowledge system. It's one great example of a mobile device that you can use for soil identification, land cover and soil health monitoring, and many other things. One of our team members did investigate all sorts of different tools for the past 6 months, and he came up with 525 tools. His name's Corey Dorn, and if you're interested, he has a presentation on those. But the idea is building tools to help find the most appropriate tool is pretty key and important. And then finally, my last item comes from a Climate Hope podcast that we recently recorded. We spoke with Amber Perez. She's the director of Climate Science Alliance. And she said, I'll paraphrase, she said, "We know that fear doesn't work. Fear can be powerful, but it can also be paralyzing. And our ability to focus on being hopeful and finding those little things where we get traction every day, and even in the broader realm, what are those things that tie you to others?" And so it comes back to relationships and finding hope every day in what you do to keep yourself nourished and moving forward. And Anne-Marie Shishili was also interviewed during that podcast. She's the director of the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. And she said, the work is challenging, but we frontliners, and I consider everybody, all of us working in rangelands frontliners, are not working in isolation. It's okay to be sad and worried and tired, and continue to persevere in small ways every day. And the last quote that I like for this Climate Hope idea is that we need a narrative that presages solutions and empowerment. So those are my 5 most recent items to help us support climate adaptation in rangelands. So being part of and building networks, working with our neighbors, incorporating climate into resource management decisions via some type of process, any process. Considering alternate management options because we're going into a new future and we're already in a new future. Test and share different types of innovations, and then ultimately maintain climate hope.
Thanks, Emily. That was excellent. We'll move now to our final panelist, Anna Maher. Anna is with the Forest Service as a resource economist in Portland, Oregon. Anna? Anna, check to see that you're not muted, please.
Hello, let's start there. Okay. Can you hear me okay, Joel?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. I will share my screen now. Sorry, just having a little. Are you seeing the slides?
Yes.
Okay. I think we're ready. My name is Anna Maher. My title is U.S. Forest Service postdoctoral researcher in livestock rangeland management. A lot of words to say, rangeland fellow. The U.S. Forest Service program is within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I was recently brought in to study rangelands in the setting of climate adaptation at the Northwest Climate Hub. This fellowship is through the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. And prior to this position, I worked at the University of Wyoming with Dr. John Tanaka and Dr. Taylor, also known as Tex, and Christy Maxco, that runs the Sustainable Rangeland Roundtable. I've learned from these folks that have dedicated their work to studying the economic impacts on livestock producers from weather, climate, invasive species, conservation practices, and many other important issues surrounding livestock producers and rangelands. I started this new position at the Climate Hub just a little more than a month ago, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today and to hear from you. While extreme weather such as drought and elements of surprise are not new to those that depend upon rangelands for their livelihoods, as we've heard about today, preparedness is something that many of us are coming to understand, even in the mainstream, the importance of more and more every day. You all know what preparedness means for you, and I would guess that you all have had your unique struggles with it over the past year or more, even the last couple of days, as was mentioned, with the snowstorms and the rolling power outages in the US here. So I have hope we can come together, joined by what it feels like to be less than prepared, and come from that place as we think about what it means to be as ready as possible for what comes our way. A little bit about what climate hubs are. The USDA maintains a network of 10 climate hubs throughout the US. And I see this as these climate hubs are one important part of what our nation is doing to help us be ready for what comes our way. These hubs were developed several years ago, and I'm here at the Northwest Climate Hub in the northwest part of the country. And the Climate Hub, Northwest Climate Hub, is actually Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and also Alaska. So climate hubs support climate-informed decision-making, as you saw from the presentations today by Emily, delivering science-based, region-specific technologies and information. Here in the Northwest Hub, we're providing information and technology support to forest landowners, natural resource managers, ranchers, Native American tribes, farmers, and technology transfer specialists, all with the goal of supporting sustainable and productive working landscapes in the Northwest. Here's a visual depiction that describes what I understand the idea behind climate hubs are, with an emphasis on what I'm interested in. So I did take the liberty of modifying this diagram a little bit, but from my understanding, the hubs are to bring together federal and non-federal partners to develop and deliver science-based information and technologies and put them in the hands of these primary stakeholders. So the people on top working to put information at the hands of the people on the bottom of this diagram. And in this position, I'm just getting started listening and observing and meeting with Forest Service people, other federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, university folk, and my colleagues at the Hub. I just want to say have done an excellent job of getting me connected quickly. And I'm a month and a half in, as I mentioned, but I'm diving right in. So, and what I'm getting is that the idea and the culture is really that collecting and disseminating up-to-date climate information requires interagency collaboration, and really collaboration at all levels, with the goal to deliver information, tools, strategies, technical solutions that are needed to support these working land decision makers in a changing climate. So when I say working land decision makers, I'm thinking of people like many of people in the audience, perhaps farmers, ranchers, land managers. I made the arrow on that right-hand side there very large because this is what I'm really interested in, is this feedback piece and making information and tools that are helpful and accessible for working land decision makers. And I think we can do that through soliciting information even more and feedback and finding more opportunities for collaboration. So how do we go from information to implementation and or adoption? In my mind, that means we need to understand the decisions people are making, the constraints that they are facing, which is a very important one, and the impacts that they are feeling, and coordinate that information with the science that is needed to inform these decisions. And I'm thinking that this collaboration and coordination effort is no small feat, and that it's going to take every one of us to do a good job. Oh, and I put there that this rangelands, because that's what I'm specializing in, but there are many other natural resource areas that apply to this climate hub. So these climate hubs have done a lot of work on this, and I encourage you to check out their resources. Here I'm showing you the main climate hub website. where you can go into your specific region and see what they have to offer, including decision support tools, case studies, and a lot of information available to you there. A little bit about what I'm doing. I'm creating a synthesis paper that's asking a changing climate. How might that impact rangeland management in the Northwest? So when we use the word adaptation, throw that around, sometimes it's not real commonplace to many people. And so I like to bring into this slide and say that a lot of people think that conservation practices often double as adaptation to climate change because they build more resilient landscapes. And all of us are very familiar with conservation practices and which conservation practices are important in your area and in your field of work. But in terms of a synthesis, what will managing for resiliency really mean, especially across all these different actors, livestock producers, land managers, recreationists, wildlife, it goes on and on. So creating information, thinking about all these different actors, especially with public lands and private rangelands. Over on the right-hand side where it says Northwest Hub, these are some of the ways that we're informing decisions. Vulnerability assessments, decision support tools, education outreach. But creating information that will ultimately be adopted may be difficult, I'm learning. There's a paper that is coming out, Dr. Wardropper, she'll actually be speaking at a talk tomorrow that I'll mention later. And this paper is under review, but just talks about how there's uncertainty with climate change. There's also uncertainty with changing the way we manage. And there are barriers that come with that, barriers to trust of information when there's a great level of uncertainty in this information that is happening as well. And then adoption also depends on our current management and policy framework, the financial incentives that we may have, and a community mindset. So all those things are important to think about, and some ideas that I want to incorporate in this synthesis that I'm putting together this year. The other thing that I am doing this year is putting together a summary of decision support tools. So decision support tools just means anything that can support land managers, stakeholders to have information to make better decisions and surrounding climate adaptation in this particular context. So this idea should be very simple, right? These are tools out there. Are tools out there. Just summarize them and post them on the web or somewhere that people can access them. But it's much more complicated than that. I feel like if I want it to be useful to people, which some of the questions I'm asking is which tools are important and to who are they important? Are we leaving some folks out? We're talking of potentially hundreds of applicable tools out there. How do we package this information in a way that is helpful for these decision makers? And I think the important thing for me to be doing is to be talking to decision makers, talking to land managers and possibly producers. So I just wanted to show you here, giving examples of decision support tools and the kinds of things we may want to know about them in such a summary. So over there on the left-hand side, it just says general tools. I changed the names to protect the innocent. I didn't want to put down the specific names as I'm trying to figure out what characteristics really go with which at this time. But this information is based on actual tools, and you can see that they all have varying levels of characteristics. Some of them are map-based, some of them are not. Some of them do apply to the Northwest, which is what I'm interested in, the Northwest Climate Hub. Some of them have a forecast or prediction element to them. Some of them don't. And then on the right-hand side, the idea there is we don't always know who's the best audience for each tool or what decision setting or decision this is informing. And so understanding more about that, I think, is going to be really helpful in making this a useful resource. So I think in developing this, the methods that I end up using are going to, including which columns are created, what kind of information people are wanting to know, are going to be helpful not only to the Northwest Climate Hub, but other climate hubs that may want to put together a similar resource in their area for tools that apply there. I also think it'll identify gaps and let us know where we may need to modify existing tools or create new tools altogether. So in summary, I'm going to be developing these two products, the synthesis and the summary of tools. And my overall interest is in facilitating two-way collaboration and finding out how we can collaborate as early as possible in the information development process. But people that know a lot more about specific decision support tools and the barriers and opportunities for collaboration are some of the people that you heard from today. And also there's a workshop coming tomorrow and also Thursday, a two-part workshop. And the first part of that workshop will be talking about these different decision tools that are out there. These are all map-based ones, and getting feedback from the audience about how they can be more applicable, then also using that information on the second day to have a nice discussion and application of that information. There's also one other workshop I've been made aware of for a tool called Fuelcast, which may be of interest to you. So just wanted to call that out. But yes, I really appreciate you having me today, and I thank you, and I hope we can all learn from each other and have a great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Great presentation. I'd ask all of the panelists to please turn on your microphones and your cameras. That way we can, as moderator, I can kind of see if you got something you want to say. And also I can detect fear. So if you look like you're scared, I'll go right in for the kill. I'll start with Angus. And Angus, this is a kind of a quasi-political question, I guess. I'm not sure. Most of the producers in the U.S. and also in Australia belong to the cattle growers or the wool growers or the Cattlemen's Beef Association, or some sort of commodity group like that. And this is particularly in relation to your participation in the Farmers for Climate Action. Did you, why did you, your group feel compelled to start that up rather than trying to go through those commodity organizations, which I think most producers feel more comfortable with?
I would believe the main reason is that we got together and we were just very dissatisfied with how a lot of these groups were actually even discussing climate change. Quite a few of them were still denying it even existed. So we just thought, well, we're the people on the ground, we're getting affected. We shall form a community of interest which can discuss these issues and look at adaptation and mitigation on the ground and how we can facilitate and help with that, but also how we can actually talk to policymakers. And policymakers are not only politicians, they're all these peak commodity bodies. And we've become members of the National Farmers Federation, and we've actually worked with them to change their policy on climate fairly significantly. So I think the big benefit is forming a community of interest who can work across different bodies and different political systems to actually try and attempt to make serious policy change, because it's policy change we need. We need adaptation and mitigation as well, but policy change is where the real issue is. And here in Australia at the federal level, as you've been having in the US, we've had quite a lot of difficulty cutting across the whole science of, people seem to hate science of climate change. They're pretty happy with science of medicine because it helps them individually right now, but there seems to be a lot of denial when it comes to climate change. And all I can say to people is go out and read the primary science and stop reading all the crap that gets put on in different media outlets. And peak organisations, go out and read the primary science on climate change, get your community together and start working out how you can put pressure on policy.
Okay, thanks. And I'll follow that one up with a question from the chat, Angus, and also for everyone else. But do you think adaptation in the ranching community among ranchers what's the role for stimulation with subsidies or incentives? Or is this strictly going to be a market-driven and response on the part of individual land managers?
Well, in Australia, agriculture doesn't get a lot in the way of subsidies and incentives, unlike, well, we've got a very different system to Australia. But I believe the best thing is getting the policy settings right, because the market will make it happen if the discussion's there and the policy settings are right. I think the biggest issue is actually making peak bodies, peak commodity bodies and politicians to take the issue seriously and put in policy settings that allow for the transition we need. And at the more local level, I think it's all about communities of interest and getting ranchers and everyone, well, we call them graziers over here, not ranchers, but getting ranchers and all associated people together to actually sit down and rationally and calmly discuss these issues and work out a way forward. Because when you've got people sitting down and actually forming relationships, the whole world's about relationships, actually. We can say what we like, but it's about relationships and forming bonds and working with people and understanding what's working or not working for other people. And that's where it all starts. And that's what goes up the line to actually set policy in the long run.
Any of the other panelists want to talk about that one? As you're all federal employees, I'm sure you'll want to talk about policy in a more of a generic way in programs and incentives as well.
Yeah, I can get off easy. Because I'm not employed by anyone, I can be rude when I have to.
I'll just take a small run at that. I think that, so when you think about, as I was mentioning, that some people, or a lot of people think about adaptation, climate adaptation in part by promoting resilience, ecological resilience within the system. And so the concept, I believe, behind the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, EQIP, is to promote some of that. And so it's not directly saying climate adaptation, but those can be thought of as ways to help. I'm thinking of, for examples, is ranchers put in prescribed grazing if that's deemed different prescribed grazing practices that can help the people be more, help with ecological resilience. And so that they do that by, it's sort of a cost share situation. So they're not paying for all the costs, but trying to make it a little bit less expensive. So we do have some of those in the US, some of those systems set up that we could create more incentives, or at least take down some financial barriers. But how that will all play out, I'm not sure.
I'll chime in on that one briefly. I think, and I know actually, that there are times when those incentives or support, rapid support, is really needed, especially as we're going into an era of more flash drought, of really rapid changes. There are times when people need some support that will carry them through to maybe allowing people to maintain their herds, right? Not having to start over with their genetics of herds. So I think there are times when it's really necessary. In part of our region, a lot of the auction houses have recently closed or over the last few years. And so ideas around things like mobile auction houses or other opportunities to make it possible for people to sell and still maintain the rangeland, I think that provision of some flexibility and efficiency is really needed, especially in the hottest and driest parts of our world.
Okay, thanks. Here's another really good question, I think. How are the climate hubs and the Farmers for Climate Action working to better include formerly marginalized people? And, you know, with our opening statement on land acknowledgements, many of the tribes, as well as many small and farmers of color, really have a hard time because they're working other jobs, or they're, you know, they don't have those long established networks. What are your groups doing to try to include all of those traditionally underserved people?
I'll jump in again. Oh, okay, I'll go quickly. Okay. So the Southwest Climate Hub has a position dedicated to working with Indigenous peoples. We have a tribal coordinator, and her name's Helena Deswood. She works with a lot of folks across the Southwest. We're also starting to support some of the 1994 land-grant universities and working with them and their professors specifically on tribes and tribal climate change issues in the Southwest, especially trying to understand traditional ecological knowledge and look for opportunities to adopt some of those, that knowledge now. So I'll stop there.
Angus?
With Farmers for Climate Action, we specifically make it friendly and go out and seek out more marginal groups and smaller operators, because we think it's very important for everyone to have a voice. So that's one of our strategies. It's not just about big ag, it's about ag full stop. And a lot of the people that really need support are the smaller operators. So I think that's really important. It's very easy to start thinking just about the big end of town, and that's important too, but we need the whole network of people that make up our community, because as I said before, it's all about relationships, and we need communities to have successful, sustainable agriculture over a long period of time. We don't need factory farming. We need communities. We need a whole range of different ways of doing things. We need a range of different people doing agriculture. And that's the future. Big ag does provide a lot of food, but in a lot of cases, it's not particularly sustainable. Smaller operators do have the ability to be more flexible and more sustainable in the long term, given the opportunities and the right policy settings. So I think it's a matter of, we just got to actually recognise that there's a whole heap of players out there and bring them together and give them not a level playing field, but give them, because playing field's never level, but to actually give them the opportunity to participate in the discussion. And everyone's got something to teach and something to learn. So by getting us all together, that's the best way forward. And as a group, we're very, very conservative. We'd like to see something successful before we're actually going to try it ourselves. And that's one of the benefits of getting people together, and someone will say, well, I'm trying this and it seems to be working, or I'm trying this and it's not working. It's a way of spreading knowledge that's happened long before we had the internet and email and everything else. And it still works very well. It's about community. It's about social groups.
Right. Thanks, Angus. And I want to follow up on that one. And because this, I thought, was a theme that everybody talked about and really identified as being important. And Emily with the networks, Haley with the working groups, Angus's group. So mostly what we've talked about so far, and we've talked about this for years. We've talked about these networks, learning networks. We get together, we share information, and we share, even now we're talking about maybe even sharing emotional support. But one thing that we really haven't addressed head on is do you see this as an opportunity to look at some of these networks and extending out to resource and financial aspects? And that is, we've always kind of talked about grass banks in the past, but do you think there's a path going forward for maybe these sort of collectives, if you will, or whatever you want to call them, for actually bringing more land into a management system under multiple owners and sharing financial resources as well? Haley, I think that one's going right for you.
Sure. So we already have this in the Great Plains. We have these really interesting grazing associations across the National Grassland System. For example, we collaborate at ARS in Fort Collins with the Crow Valley Livestock. And there's another grazing association on the other half of the Pawnee. They've been there since 1939. So they're already an organized, incorporated group of ranchers who collaborate to mitigate risk and democratically represent producer interests across the landscape scale. They share infrastructure costs. They coordinate and share resources. They track decision making. They support each other. So we already have this in some examples on public land and I think we can start to think about those grazing associations as key case studies where we could understand adaptation. I think they've had less turnover and less consolidation than other parts of the country, but that's just a hypothesis. But also as like a key, opportunities where grazing permit administration and some of the policies and programs that are available to us in public land management agencies to put together adaptation at the landscape scale. So if we're talking about drought adaptation and climate variability adaptation as a landscape and community scale, an economic scale in ranching communities, and a succession problem, we already have some structure in place to work with. I don't know that we have to reinvent the wheel, but there might be other models that are more appropriately matched to other social and ecological contexts. In places that are more arid, there aren't as many producers on the landscape, and so that kind of thinking might not work. But I'm interested in looking at that and thinking about how permit administration can be more adaptive given that existing social structure.
Emily, has there been any discussion in the drought learning networks that you're involved with about trying to pool these resources?
So the way the drought learning networks came about was to focus on some of the biggest challenges that folks were seeing. And so one of the first ones was how to respond rapidly during drought to make sure people have the information that they need. And then another challenge people saw was that people, especially in indigenous communities, weren't getting the information that they needed at the scale that was necessary. So I could absolutely see some groups coming together. One might be the Pueblos. So there are 19 Pueblos in New Mexico, and they're working together through the Drought Learning Network. And I could see that that collaboration could maybe not necessarily build a pooling of resources. It might, but I think that having it as an open collaboration with minimal top-down management that allows people to identify needs and respond collectively, I could see it going in that direction for a few of the teams that we mentioned in the slideshow.
Anna, as the only panelist that had the nerve to put economist on your job title, do you have any experience? And I mean, do we have any good models for something like this that are well documented enough that we could pick up some guiding principles?
I think so economics, as far as I've made connections, says a few things about this. As I talked about, there's in terms of changing management, there's uncertainty. And when there's uncertainty, people tend to wait to make decisions until they have more information, which I think is some of the problems we're might be seeing with people adopting new strategies. But we hear a lot about how people learn peer-to-peer and also by co-producing things and learning from extension agents. And so those are important things to bring in. And I think we talked a little bit about forage sharing, and I'm very excited about maybe collaborating with some of these folks to learn more about how these areas that are more variable in weather may be able to be brought, their strategies that they're using may be able to be brought over to places like the Pacific Northwest and things like that. But one of the things that I've learned is that the cost of destocking, so when you're talking about producers, the cost of destocking cattle can be very expensive when it comes to drought. And that I think that is why people want to talk about forage sharing and such like that. And I also, just on a personal note, have noticed that and wonder if there are opportunities at the public level where we can somehow share forage in a way that can make people more resilient in times of extremes. I had heard of instance where an allotment with a rancher that was on fire during this last year was able to, they were able to give a nearby allotment. And so kind of preparing a little bit more in advance for maybe the possibility, some contingency plans of that sort of thing happening, and really evaluating what resources we have and the impacts that people might be feeling and making those connections. I think it's going to be really important.
Thanks. Angus, I know in Australia they've talked for years about property consolidation and trying to get the properties right-sized for dealing with both market and natural forces. Have you guys had any experience with these sort of management cooperatives or anything like that?
Out in this part of the world where I live, it hasn't happened. We have had properties increase in size. Post the Second World War, there was a lot of land put out for, they called them soldier settler blocks, and they were way too small. They were starvation blocks, and gradually holdings have been amalgamated into bigger holdings to make it more sustainable. But one of the big issues, and just going on one of the questions down there, one of the big issues is just how variable, and we're in what they call boom and bust country out here. We get huge rainfalls and extreme dry events, and I would love to go back into breeding. I like breeding, and I like having cows and calves and everything that goes with it. But just from a land management perspective, it allows me, going into feeders allows me to actually be able to destock when I need to. We had the issue, whole of Eastern Australia under drought. We couldn't get adjustment for cows and calves. We couldn't sell cows and calves, costing us a fortune to feed them. So it just gives us so much more flexibility, but not everyone can do that. But I think because of all the breeding north of here, and also down in what we call the softer country, where higher rainfall and more reliable climate is where most of the breeding is going to happen. But there's financial implications whichever way you go. But one other point I'd like to make is that for those of us that live on the land, we are probably the only major industry that actually can end up being carbon negative. We have a lot of potential in the whole battle against climate change. It's about how we manage the country and a whole heap of other factors, but we can and will end up being carbon negative, and there's a lot of opportunities there. We just got to work on how we can actually benefit from those opportunities and start to take action towards it.
Thanks, Angus. I did want to point that out. I saw quite a few questions popping up in the chat about carbon sequestration or greenhouse gas emission reduction. And because of the limited time and the complexity of talking about adaptation versus mitigation, we agreed that we weren't really going to talk about mitigation. So for all of you asking questions about carbon sequestration or emission reduction, that'll have to be another panel discussion. So we're down to about 8 minutes left. I did want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to summarize or hit on anything that they heard during the discussion. Let's start with Emily. I'll give you a minute or so to kind of summarize what you thought the session was about today.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. It was really interesting to hear what everyone had to say and also to see the questions that were coming in. Really great questions coming in, and I wish we could had more time to answer all of them. For me, I think we need to start thinking a little more longer term, and allowing for more flexibility in the system and in the decisions that people are making. I especially heard that that neighbors and communities and groups and networks learning from one another and supporting one another in a lot of different ways is really important. When I talk about thinking longer term, I'm talking about planting climate adapted trees and building appropriate retention basins and thinking a little bit further ahead than we tend to think. I also think that extreme events, we often manage to the mean, and that we are living in a time of extremes. We had a bomb cyclone last year, first one, derecho. We're living through those climate extremes now. And so to build more resilience in our system is to pay attention to how we manage during those extremes, because it's a lot less scary when you realize you've been through it. Things are changing, and there are places where we can learn. Listening to what Angus had to say was really interesting, because you can start thinking about climate analogs. What places are in the world are where you think you'll be in 20 years? And what can you learn from people in those places? And so for me, it's about talking with people, about communities, about thinking a little longer term and thinking a little more broadly to talk with others and learn what they're seeing and what they're doing on the landscape. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Emily. Anna, would you like to finish up, please?
Oh, I'll just say that I really enjoyed all the talks that we had today. And there's so much to think about surrounding these issues, and it's a long process, and some of it, I feel like we're just getting started. But I think that just to leave with you that to be aware that when we talk about things like ecological resilience and in terms of preparation and such for adaptation, that there are costs to these, and there are barriers to land managers, there are barriers to producers, and whatever we can do to take down those barriers, especially costs. The thing about costs is that we might say that a producer might gain from these different methods of resilience, but there's an upfront cost and the benefit is not realized until far out into the future. So these are real constraints for these folks, and to keep that in mind. A little more discussion about costs as we're going into this. So thank you again, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Anna. Haley, what are your parting thoughts?
Yeah, it's just good to be here. I thought about there's a glacier about a mile from my house, and you can walk up the path where the glacier has receded since the 1930s. They put these little gravestones, so it's right in your face here in Juneau, and it's really influenced my thinking to be in Alaska, to be working in a totally different context. But I still think, after hearing Angus talk and thinking about some of the comments that are coming in, that maybe it's time to leave behind this idea that climate change is a psychological problem, and to start thinking about what we can all do in our work in the agencies and the organizations that we work in to, as a community of rangeland scholars and managers, rethink our responsibility to the challenge as well. I think we overemphasize concern over whether producers are adapting. And when I talk to producers, they don't feel like they have a lot of control over anything that's going on. Certainly not. They're trying to be flexible, and they're working really hard to be flexible, and they know that's important, and they understand climate and weather. So maybe it's time for us to look back on ourselves and think about what we can do rather than focus on that psychological scale, which tends to put a lot of pressure on individual producers as sort of the problem. And I just don't see it that way. So.
Thanks, Haley. We'll finish up with Angus. I assume you're not concerned about the glacier outside your door, Angus.
Sorry, I was on mute. Oh, no, I wasn't on mute.
No, you're on mute now, Angus.
It's been many millions of years since there's any ice or snow or glaciers in this part of the world. But the thing I'm pretty much going to say what the others are saying. Climate change is here, right here and now. It's affecting us now. But to look at, well, one of the questions was where we're going to be in the longer term, and how we do agriculture and where we do agriculture is going to change over time because of climate change. But as I was saying, people with land and managing land are the only big industry that has the opportunity to be carbon negative. And there's lots of things the world can do without, but they can't do without food and water. So there are going to be opportunities, along with lots of challenges, and there's lots of financial challenges, as we know, but it's a matter of accepting we have an issue, working together and working out the best way forward and working out how best to take opportunities that arise and keep moving forward. And I just thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all up in the other part of the world where things are different but the same as well.
All right, thank you. Everybody did a great job. First of all, I want to thank the panelists for exceptionally good content, and secondly, for staying on time. Both of those, as moderator, those are equally important in my eyes. I want to thank the attendees. I think we peaked out at about 560 today. So that is a pretty darn good response. Finally, I want to thank Dr. David Toledo for helping us out and just getting the support that we needed to pull this session off. So thank you, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at some other sessions later this week. So long.